at a grand event held in the heart of the royal palace. A mixture of high-ranking officials, dignitaries, and members of the royal family filled the halls. The air was charged with an elegant tension as the royal guard stood in formation, perfectly, still their eyes fixed forward with unwavering focus. Each one of them represented a symbol of strength and discipline. It was a tradition that had been passed down through generations, a symbol of the monarchy's power and the dedication of those who served it. Among them was one guard who stood out from the rest, not because of his stature or appearance, but because of the quiet aura he carried. While the other guards might have appeared slightly stiff or tense, he stood with a subtle confidence that came from years of service, the kind of service that was rooted not just in duty, but in a deep understanding of what it meant to protect something greater than oneself. On this particular day, a high-ranking officer known for his sharp demeanor and quick commands was overseeing the royal procession. He was known throughout the palace for his sense of authority and his no-nonsense attitude. His gaze scanned the room, ensuring everything was in perfect order. The guards stood still, every inch of their posture precise. It was a moment of pride for the officer, knowing that the display of military strength was a testament to the royal family's unshakable power. However, today, something unusual was about to unfold. The officer surveying the guard selected one. This guard, whose face remained as stoic as ever, was someone the officer had admired for his discipline. With a gesture that was more like a swift, confident movement, the officer raised his hand and gave the command. It was simple, a command that had been given countless times before at countless royal events. A salute, a sign of respect, loyalty, and honor. But as the officer's command echoed through the hall, something unexpected happened. The guard did not respond immediately. For a split second, time seemed to stand still. The room was filled with a quiet hum, the kind that only occurs when there's a subtle shift in the usual order of things. The other guards glanced nervously at the one who had been singled out. The officer's gaze hardened, waiting for the salute, but the guard didn't move. The officer's eyes narrowed, his impatience growing. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had given the order. A salute was expected, just as it always was. But the guard stood there, still and unmoving, his eyes fixed straight ahead as if he hadn't heard the command at all. The silence that followed was thick. The officer took a step forward, his boots clicking sharply against the marble floor. He had trained his entire life for moments like this, moments where discipline was everything and a single mistake could cost dearly. He wasn't about to let this guard defy him without consequences. "Soldier!" The officer's voice rang out again, louder this time, cutting through the silence. "Salute!" The room held its breath. The other guards continued to stand firm, but their eyes flickered between the officer and the guard who hadn't responded. The high-ranking officer's face tightened with anger. This wasn't simply a matter of following orders. This was about authority, about maintaining control. And this guard, this one soldier, had just broken that unspoken rule. But still, the guard did not move. There was something in the way he stood, something unyielding. The officer's irritation only deepened, but he couldn't shake the strange, almost magnetic presence the guard held. It was as if he were testing something, though no one could yet understand what it was. In the officer's mind, there was no room for hesitation. This guard needed to understand his place in the hierarchy, and the officer was prepared to remind him of that, no matter the cost. The officer stepped closer, now standing just a few feet away from the guard. The tension between them was palpable, an almost electric charge in the air. The officer's voice was cold now, calculated. I said, "Salute." The guard's eyes remained forward, unwavering, and for a moment it seemed like the world around them had faded into the background. It wasn't that he didn't hear the command. It wasn't that he didn't understand it. He simply did not respond. And that was the heart of the matter, the defiance. Not in the form of a loud protest or a shout. No, this was something quieter. It was a refusal to follow without question. A statement that just because an order was given, it didn't mean it should always be followed without thought. The officer's mind raced. This wasn't what he had expected at all. The guard had been a model of discipline for years, and now at the peak of this royal ceremony the guard was challenging him, silently, but powerfully. The officer was caught in a whirlwind of emotions, anger, confusion, frustration, but also perhaps a small flicker of respect. He couldn't deny it. The guard had a strength of character that was undeniable. The other officers in the room exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. They had never witnessed a scene like this before. The crowd of dignitaries and officials who had been murmuring quietly among themselves now fell silent as they sensed something extraordinary was happening. The usual smooth flow of the event had been disrupted. The officer's thoughts swirled. He needed to restore order. This kind of behavior could not be allowed to go unpunished. But something in the back of his mind told him that this was not just a simple act of defiance. There was more at play here, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. And it left him unsettled. He could feel the weight of the moment, the significance of what was unfolding. The officer was used to having control over every situation, but here, in this rare instance, he felt like the scales had tipped, and he was no longer the one in charge. The guard's gaze never faltered. He stood as solid as a statue, his posture perfect, his resolve unbroken. He was, in that moment, the embodiment of the values that the royal guard held dear: honor, discipline, and a sense of duty. But now, it was clear that he was also testing the very system that had made him who he was, and it was something the officer had never expected to see. The officer opened his mouth to speak again, his words sharp and forceful, but as he did, he realized something. The room had gone quiet. There was a stillness now that wasn't just the result of discipline, but something deeper. It was as if the very air had thickened with the anticipation of what would come next. Would the guard relent? Would he give in and salute, restoring order? Or was this just the beginning of something much larger, something that could not easily be swept aside? For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. The officer's pride, the guard's dignity, and the entire reputation of the royal guards rested on what would happen next. And then, the guard did something that no one had expected. He did not salute. He did not speak. Instead, he remained motionless, a single unspoken challenge hanging in the air. It was a challenge that went far beyond the simple act of saluting. It was a challenge to the very nature of authority and control. It was a statement that, perhaps, this day would not be like any other. The officer, still locked in the tension of the moment, felt a shift within him. He had a decision to make. How would he respond? Would he enforce his will, or would he listen to the silent challenge that the guard had put forth? It was a moment that would change everything. The high-ranking officer stood there, frozen for a moment, his mind racing. His eyes were fixed on the royal guard who stood before him, unmoving as though time had slowed around them. The silence in the room was almost deafening. He could hear the faintest rustle of fabric, the soft sounds of people shifting their weight, but it was all drowned by the weight of the moment. No one knew what would happen next, and that uncertainty made the tension even more unbearable. The officer's jaw tightened as he stood face to face with the guard. He had given an order, a simple command. It was something that had been expected of every soldier, every guard, every officer for as long as anyone could remember. A salute, a symbol of respect, a sign of loyalty. And yet, here he was, staring at a soldier who refused to comply. It wasn't just that the guard hadn't moved. It was the way he stood. His back straight, his gaze unflinching, his posture as solid as the stone walls of the palace surrounding them. It was clear to the officer that this wasn't a simple mistake or a lapse in attention. The guard wasn't distracted. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't confused. He was deliberately resisting. The officer's mind shifted quickly from surprise to frustration. How could this happen? How could one guard standing in front of him defy him in such a public, bold way? It was unthinkable. And yet, the guard's unwavering silence spoke volumes. It was as if he were saying, "I am not here to follow blindly." The officer's grip on his own composure was slipping, but he was determined not to show weakness. He was an officer of the highest rank, respected by everyone around him. He had been entrusted with the duty to maintain order, to ensure that the traditions of the royal family were upheld, and to command the respect of everyone in his presence. And yet here was this one guard, a single soldier, throwing all of that into question. He had given his order again, louder this time, his voice sharp and commanding. The other guards, the officers and the royal guests, watched the scene unfold, each person feeling the weight of the unusual turn of events. Some were intrigued, some were uncomfortable, but all were captivated by what was happening. The guard still did not move. Not an inch. His eyes remained fixed forward as if nothing in the world could disturb his focus. There was no fear, no hesitation, just a quiet but powerful defiance that seemed to pulse in the air. The officer, his frustration growing, took a step forward. His boots clicked sharply against the marble floor, each step a clear signal that he was losing patience. "Soldier," he barked, his voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. "You will salute now. You will show the respect that is due, or you will face the consequences." But still the guard did not react. His face was as calm as ever, his expression unreadable. It was as though the officer's words had no weight, no power. The silence stretched on, unbearable in its intensity. The officer could feel his temper rising. How dare this soldier challenge him like this? Did the guard not understand the severity of his actions? He had been trained to follow orders, to stand firm, but also to show respect to his superiors, and yet here he was, refusing to do so in the most public of ways, in front of the royal family, the dignitaries, and everyone else in the room. But as the officer's anger flared, a small voice in the back of his mind began to whisper, something wasn't right. This wasn't about defiance for the sake of defiance. There was something deeper here, something the officer couldn't quite grasp. The officer's eyes never left the guard. He could see the subtle tension in the guard's posture, the way his muscles were poised, ready for anything. But the guard remained still, unmoving, not a single sign of weakness in his stance. And that made the officer wonder, was this guard testing him? Or was this about something far more important than a simple salute? The officer's gaze hardened. This was not a time for doubt or hesitation. He needed to regain control of the situation. His mind moved quickly, calculating the consequences of every word, every action. If he allowed this defiance to go unchallenged, it could undermine everything. The discipline of the entire unit, the authority of the monarchy, and the respect that was demanded of those who served. The officer inhaled sharply, then stepped even closer to the guard, closing the distance between them. The air around them seemed to thicken with the growing tension, as though every person in the room was holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. He could hear the faint sounds of whispers behind him, some dignitaries shifting uncomfortably, others glancing at each other, unsure of how to interpret what was unfolding. Even the other guards stood a little straighter, as if bracing themselves for the next move. But the officer did not turn around. His attention was fixed entirely on the guard, whose unyielding stance was like a challenge. It was as if the guard were daring the officer to react, daring him to push further. The officer knew he couldn't let the guard's silent rebellion go unchallenged, but he also knew that the consequences of his next move were far greater than just one soldier's disobedience. "Why do you not salute?" the officer asked, his voice now quieter, yet still laced with authority. There was a moment of silence between them, a brief pause that felt like an eternity. The guard's eyes shifted ever so slightly, but his expression remained unchanged. "Sir, I respect the uniform, the duty, and the monarchy," the guard said, his voice steady without the slightest hint of fear. "But respect must be earned. It cannot be demanded." The officer's chest tightened. It was not what he had expected to hear. For a moment he was caught off guard, his anger momentarily giving way to a flicker of confusion. Was the guard questioning the very foundations of their military hierarchy? Was this about respect for authority, or was it something deeper? The officer stood silently, staring into the guard's eyes as if searching for something. A sign of weakness, perhaps, or an explanation for this quiet but powerful resistance. But all he saw was resolve. The guard's words had been simple, but they were filled with a quiet strength, a strength that was difficult to ignore. The officer took a step back, momentarily unsure of what to do next. He had been in command for years, his authority unquestioned, But now, standing in front of this single soldier, he was confronted with a challenge that he hadn't anticipated. And for a brief moment he wondered if the guard was right, if respect truly had to be earned. Could that be what was happening here? Was the guard in his own way asking for something more than just a salute? The silence lingered in the air, thick and heavy. The officer felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His mind raced, and yet there was no clear answer. The world around him seemed to fade away for just a moment. The royal family, the dignitaries, the rest of the guards, everything was silent, as if they were all waiting for him to make the next move. And in that silence, the officer realized that this was not just about a salute anymore. It was about something much deeper, something that would define the rest of his career, and possibly the future of the entire guard. The officer took another step back, his mind still racing, his thoughts now more focused than ever. Whatever would happen next, it would be a decision that would shape the course of everything to come. The room was holding its breath, waiting. The officer stood there still, as if the words spoken by the guard had somehow frozen him in place. His heart raced, his thoughts chaotic. The room was heavy with tension, every eye in the crowd watching with bated breath. The situation had spiraled into something far beyond the simple exchange of military protocol. It wasn't just about the salute anymore. It was about respect, authority, and the very nature of the command that had been issued. For a moment, the officer couldn't bring himself to speak. The guard's words echoed in his mind. Respect must be earned. He had never considered that concept before. In his world, authority was absolute. Orders were meant to be followed, no questions asked. But here, in front of him, stood a man who was challenging everything he believed about leadership and obedience. The officer's gaze shifted to the rest of the guards, standing in perfect formation around him. They were motionless as they had been trained, yet their eyes betrayed a subtle tension. Some of them looked at the officer for guidance, others glanced at the guard who had refused to salute. It was clear that they were waiting for the officer to take control of the situation, to restore the order they had all been taught to uphold. But the officer was struggling. He had always prided himself on his ability to command a room, to assert his authority with confidence. And yet in this moment, he felt the slightest crack in his armor. This one soldier, this one act of defiance had shaken him. He was no longer sure how to proceed. The officer swallowed, trying to steady his nerves. He had to regain control. He couldn't allow this act of defiance to go unpunished. His pride, his authority, everything he stood for was at stake. But the longer he stood there staring at the guard, the more he realized that the challenge wasn't as simple as it seemed. There was something deeper at play here, something that went beyond the surface of military tradition. "Why are you doing this?" the officer finally asked, his voice quieter now, a touch of uncertainty creeping into his tone. "You know the rules. You know what is expected of you. Why refuse to follow such a simple command?" The guard's expression remained unreadable. His eyes were steady, unwavering, as if he were looking not at the officer but through him, to some distant place beyond the room. It was a gaze that made the officer uncomfortable. It was the look of someone who was not afraid of consequences, not afraid of what might happen next. The guard's voice was calm, almost too calm, as he spoke again. "Respect is not something that is simply given because of rank or title. It must be earned, and right now I do not see why I should salute without understanding why." The words hung in the air, powerful in their simplicity. The officer had expected defiance, anger, or perhaps fear. But instead he was met with a quiet challenge, an invitation to think differently. The guard wasn't just refusing to follow an order. He was asking for something more, a deeper understanding, a conversation about what it truly meant to serve and to lead. The officer's mind raced again, but this time, his thoughts were not filled with anger. Instead, there was a flicker of curiosity, something he had not expected. How had this soldier come to this conclusion? What had led him to question the very foundation of military authority? The officer looked at the guard, his eyes narrowing slightly, trying to see beneath the surface. He had spent years climbing the ranks, earning the respect of his peers, learning to command with precision. But now, standing before him, was a soldier who was questioning the very idea of respect that he had held so firmly in place. The officer took a slow breath, then nodded slightly. "I understand what you are saying," he said, his voice softer now. But you must also understand that authority is not about personal feelings or understanding. It is about maintaining order, ensuring that everyone follows the rules. Without that, chaos would reign. The guard did not respond immediately, but his gaze softened ever so slightly. It was as if he understood what the officer was trying to say, but at the same time he was still holding on to his own beliefs. The officer could see it in his eyes. This was not about being stubborn or rebellious. The guard was simply standing firm in his own understanding of what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. The officer looked around the room again, noticing the curious glances from the other guards and officers. The situation had escalated beyond just a matter of discipline. It had become a philosophical debate, a question of what it meant to serve, to lead, and to respect. He couldn't help but wonder, was the guard right? Did respect need to be earned, or was it something that should be automatically given because of rank and position? In that moment, the officer felt the weight of the question. He had never considered it before, but now standing in front of this soldier, it seemed impossible to ignore. "Do you think I am wrong?" the officer asked, his voice more thoughtful than before. "Do you believe that a person in my position should not expect respect from those beneath me?" The guard took a moment to respond, his eyes still locked on the officer's. "I don't believe you are wrong, but I believe that respect is not something that should be demanded. It should be given freely, based on the actions and values of the person who holds power. It should be earned through integrity, fairness, and the way one leads." The officer's heart skipped a beat. The words resonated with him in a way he had not anticipated. This wasn't just a soldier questioning his authority. It was someone offering a different perspective, one that forced him to look at his own role, his own leadership, in a new light. The room was still, silent, as if everyone were waiting for the officer's response. The tension was thick, the air heavy with anticipation. It was clear that whatever happened next would change the course of the conversation, and possibly the course of the officer's future. The officer blinked, realizing that the guard had done something he had never expected. He had forced him to question himself. For the first time in years, the officer wondered if there was more to leadership than simply giving orders and expecting compliance. Could it be that the true measure of authority came not from power, but from the respect that was earned through action and integrity? The officer took a step back, his mind spinning with these new thoughts. He had been so focused on maintaining control, on ensuring that his authority was never questioned, that he had never stopped to consider the deeper implications of what it meant to lead. But now, standing in front of this guard, he realized that perhaps he had been wrong all along. The guard, for his part, remained calm, still holding his posture with dignity and resolve. He had not expected to win this argument or to change the officer's mind. He had simply wanted to make a point, to show that there was more to respect than blind obedience. The officer took a deep breath, his thoughts settling. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. He had to make a decision, and whatever choice he made would define his leadership moving forward. Finally, the officer spoke again, his voice steady. I think you have given me something to think about," he said quietly. "Perhaps it's time that I reevaluate what true respect means. Thank you for reminding me." The guard nodded, a slight hint of approval in his eyes. It wasn't the answer the officer had expected, but it was a start. A beginning of a deeper conversation about authority, leadership, and respect, and for the first time in that room, the officer felt a shift, an understanding that there was more to being in charge than simply issuing commands. There was something more profound, something that could only be earned through trust, integrity, and the willingness to listen. The officer stood still, taking in everything the guard had said. There was a new layer of understanding in his mind, something he hadn't anticipated. His focus had always been on control, on making sure every person followed orders without question. But now, with the conversation hanging in the air, he began to realize that there was more to leadership than he had ever truly understood. As he glanced around the room, he saw the other officers and guards watching him. Their eyes were curious, but there was also a sense of respect or perhaps relief. It was as though they too were waiting to see how the officer would respond. His decision here would shape not only his future as an officer, but the morale and the direction of the entire guard. The officer turned back to face the guard, his posture softer now, less rigid than before. He had been prepared for a confrontation, but instead, he was faced with a thought-provoking question. For the first time, he felt as though he had to truly consider the meaning of the values he had spent years upholding. "Do you believe that a person in my position should always be questioned?" the officer asked, his voice steady but calm. He wasn't angry anymore. In fact, he felt something akin to admiration. The guard had done something rare. He had made him think. The guard's eyes never wavered, his expression still neutral, yet there was a quiet strength in the way he held himself. It was the same strength that had stopped the officer in his tracks earlier. It wasn't arrogance or rebellion. It was something deeper. The guard had no intention of challenging the officer simply for the sake of it. Instead, he was testing the officer's values, questioning the very foundation of leadership. "I don't believe questioning authority is wrong," the guard said calmly. "I believe that true authority comes from respect. But respect, as I said before, has to be earned. You don't just get it because of your rank. You earn it through your actions, your integrity, and how you lead. And if those things are missing, then the respect you demand will be empty." The officer absorbed the words, feeling a strange but undeniable shift in his own perspective. He had spent his life demanding respect, but had he earned it, truly earned it, through his actions and his leadership? He had always expected his position to be enough, but now, standing before this young soldier, he began to see the cracks in his own thinking. There was a moment of silence between them. The officer was no longer sure of how to respond. The guard's words had cut deeper than any direct disobedience could have. They were a challenge not just to his authority, but to his way of thinking, his entire career. How had he gotten so caught up in the idea that respect could be commanded, that it could be demanded? "Then," the officer said, his voice a little quieter now, "what would you have me do? How should I lead if not through commands and expectations?" There was a trace of vulnerability in his question, a rare moment of uncertainty that only came when someone had been forced to reconsider their entire approach. The guard paused, as if he were carefully considering his answer. "Leadership," he said after a moment, "is not about being above everyone else. It's about guiding others, inspiring them to follow because they believe in what you stand for. It's about showing them that you value them, that their actions matter, that they are part of something bigger than themselves. That's how you earn respect." The officer nodded slowly. The words were simple, but they struck him with an intensity he hadn't expected. He had always viewed leadership as something that came from his rank, his position, but this guard was suggesting something completely different. He was saying that leadership wasn't about authority at all. It was about connection. It was about trust. It was about showing the people under your command that you valued them, that you respected them as individuals. As the officer processed the guard's words, he felt a weight lifting off him. He had spent years enforcing rules, cracking down on any hint of insubordination, thinking that this was the way to maintain order. But now he saw that it was only through earning the respect of those who followed him that he could truly lead. The officer took a deep breath, feeling a sense of clarity that he hadn't known before. It was as if the fog that had clouded his judgment for so long had suddenly cleared. He realized now that he had been leading out of fear, out of a desire to control, rather than out of a desire to build something meaningful. "Is that why you refused the salute?" the officer asked, looking at the guard. "Not because of disrespect, but because I haven't earned it in your eyes?" The guard nodded once, his gaze never wavering. "Exactly. Respect is a two-way street. You can't expect it just because of your title or position. You have to show others that you deserve it, through your actions, your leadership, your ability to guide and support them." The officer let the words sink in. There was so much he had taken for granted in his career. He had believed that respect came automatically with his position. But now, hearing the soldier speak so calmly and with such conviction, he realized how wrong he had been. He turned away for a moment, glancing at the other guards in the room. They had been watching the exchange, and their expressions told him everything. Some of them looked impressed, others were quietly considering what had been said. It was clear that the officer was no longer the only one who was being tested. After a long pause, the officer spoke again, his voice steady but with a new sense of humility. "I can see now that I've been wrong. I've been so focused on maintaining control that I lost sight of what true leadership is about. It's not about issuing commands and expecting blind obedience. It's about earning trust, showing respect, and guiding others to become their best selves." There was a murmur in the room, a shift in the atmosphere. The officers and guards who had been tense moments before now seemed to relax. It was as though they, too, could feel the change that was happening in the officers' understanding. The air felt different now, lighter, less heavy with unspoken tension. The officer turned back to the guard, his expression softening. "You've taught me something today, something I should have known all along." "Thank you." The guard nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's my honor to serve, sir." The officer looked at him for a moment longer, a new sense of respect growing within him. He had always seen the guard as someone who simply followed orders, as someone whose role was to stand still and silent. But now he saw something much deeper. This soldier wasn't just a cog in the machine. He was a person with his own values, his own understanding of what it meant to serve and to lead. As the officer took a step back, he realized that the room had changed. The guards were no longer simply soldiers following commands. They were individuals who had their own thoughts, their own sense of honor, and their own reasons for being there. And it was the officer's job, now more than ever, to see them for who they truly were. With that realization, the officer turned to address the room. His voice was clear, confident, and yet there was a softness to it that hadn't been there before. "From now on, we will lead with respect. We will guide each other, and we will build trust. It is not enough for me to give orders and expect obedience. I must earn your respect through my actions, through my leadership." The guards nodded, some of them exchanging glances, but all of them seemed to share the same understanding. They had witnessed a transformation, not just in their officer, but in the very way they viewed their roles. The officer stood taller now, but it wasn't just because of his position. It was because he had found something more important, a deeper understanding of what it meant to lead, and a renewed sense of purpose in his own role. The room fell into a profound silence as the officer finished speaking. The guards, still and observant, had heard the shift in his voice, the newfound humility that had replaced the previous sharp command. For the first time in years, the officer felt like he wasn't just commanding a group of soldiers, but truly leading them, guiding them through understanding. He had made a promise, both to himself and to his men, that things would be different from this moment forward. The guard who had challenged him remained calm, his posture as disciplined as ever. There was no smugness in his demeanor, no gloating or attempt to seek validation. Instead, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his words had made a difference. He had done more than simply disobey an order. He had opened the officer's eyes to something much more important, and in doing so he had reshaped the way the officer would lead from now on. The officer's eyes lingered on the guard for a moment longer, his thoughts turning inward. He had always seen leadership as a one-way street. He gave orders and his subordinates obeyed. That was the order of things. But now, as he looked at the men and women around him, he realized that leadership wasn't about power or authority. It was about trust. It was about mutual respect. And for the first time, he felt that trust flowing back toward him from his own soldiers. It was a feeling that was foreign to him, one he hadn't experienced in the same way in all his years of service. And yet there it was, the quiet understanding that they were all in this together, that they shared the same mission, the same values, and that true leadership came from the ability to listen and adapt. He turned away from the guard, scanning the room as he spoke again, his voice steady but warm. "We will continue to follow the traditions of the Royal Guard, but we will also create a new tradition, a tradition where respect is earned, where we build each other up, and where leadership is something that is shared, not just demanded." The guards, one by one, nodded in agreement. There was a palpable shift in the room, an unspoken bond that had been forged through the officer's newfound understanding. The once rigid walls of authority that had separated them now felt less significant. There was still a structure, of course, but it was one built on mutual trust, not fear. They no longer felt like mere followers of commands. They felt like participants in something greater, something that required each of them to contribute, to be a part of the team. The officer could feel it too. He stood taller, not because he was above anyone, but because he had learned something that made him stronger, not in position, but in character. For the first time, he saw himself as one of them, not just someone in charge of them, and that shift in perspective made all the difference. He caught the eye of another officer standing at attention nearby. This officer had been watching the entire exchange, his expression neutral at first, but now there was a subtle glimmer of respect in his gaze. It was the first time in a long while that the officer felt he had truly earned the respect of his peers, not through his title, but through his willingness to change, to listen, and to grow. A few moments passed before the officer spoke again, his voice more reflective this time. "I owe you all an apology," he said, addressing the entire group. "For too long I have led with an iron fist, expecting obedience without understanding. But I see now that true leadership is about more than that. It's about being there for each other, guiding each other through difficult times, and most importantly, it's about showing you the respect you deserve." The officer paused, his words sinking in. The guards exchanged looks, some of them nodding, others quietly contemplating what had just been said. It was a moment of genuine change, a rare instance when an officer had the courage to admit that he had been wrong, and to offer a path forward that would benefit everyone. The guard who had refused to salute stepped forward, his expression unchanged but his voice soft. "We are all in this together, sir. We lead by example and we follow by choice. That's how respect is built." The officer smiled, a small but genuine smile. He had never imagined that such a simple exchange could lead to such a profound transformation, both within himself and within the guard. It was a lesson that had come hard-earned, but it was one that he knew would stay with him for the rest of his career. As the room began to settle into a new sense of camaraderie, the officer felt the weight of his responsibility in a way he hadn't before. He had always known the importance of his role, but now it felt different. He wasn't just a figurehead of authority. He was a leader, someone who had to earn the respect of those who followed him every day. The days that followed were a reflection of the change that had occurred in that room. The officer began to lead with more humility, more openness, and more understanding. He took time to listen to his men, to ask them about their thoughts, their concerns, and their ideas for how things could improve. There was no longer an invisible wall between him and his soldiers. Instead, there was a bond that grew stronger with each passing day, a bond built on trust and respect. The guard who had initially refused to salute became a quiet but steady presence, his actions now speaking volumes about the power of integrity and standing by one's beliefs. He never sought attention for himself, nor did he hold any animosity toward the officer. Instead, he worked alongside his comrades, guiding them with the same quiet strength that had inspired the officer to change. As the months went by, the officer's transformation became evident. The morale of the entire guard improved. The soldiers felt more empowered, more involved, and more connected to the mission they served. They were no longer just following orders. They were part of a team, and their voices were heard. They respected each other not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The officer's relationship with his men deepened. He learned to trust them, and in turn they learned to trust him. The respect that had once been demanded was now freely given, not because of his rank, but because of the way he led, with integrity, with fairness, and with a genuine desire to see everyone succeed. The royal family took notice of the change as well. They had always known that the royal guards were strong and disciplined, but now they saw something even more powerful. A group of men and women who worked together as one, who respected each other and their leader, and who embodied the very values they had sworn to protect. The officer often thought back to that pivotal moment, when the guard had stood before him refusing to salute. At the time, it had seemed like a challenge, an act of defiance. But in hindsight, he saw it for what it truly was, an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to become a better leader. And in the end, that moment had changed not only the officer, but the entire royal guard. The respect they had for one another was no longer just a formality. It was the foundation of everything they did. They had all learned in their own way that true leadership wasn't about command or control. It was about earning the trust of those you led and building something together that was stronger than any single person. The officer smiled as he watched his men stand in formation, their faces calm, their postures proud. They were a team and he was proud to lead them. But he also knew that the true honor wasn't in his position, but in the way they worked together, in the way they trusted and respected each other. It was a bond that could never be broken, a bond that would last for as long as they served together. Months passed since that pivotal moment when the officer's understanding of leadership had been challenged. Things had changed, not just in the guard's approach to their duties, but in the officer's approach to his role. The shift wasn't just about making one change in a moment of crisis. It was about a deep internal transformation that affected everything, from how he spoke to his men to how he saw his own authority. The guards, who had once seen him as a figure to be obeyed without question, now viewed him as a leader in the truest sense of the word. There was a sense of unity among them now, a quiet strength that had been missing before. They weren't just soldiers carrying out orders anymore. They were part of something greater, a collective mission, and their bond was stronger because of it. The officer's own transformation was just as evident. He had begun to understand the power of respect in a way he never had before. It wasn't something that could be demanded, nor was it something that came automatically with rank. It had to be earned, and it could only be earned through actions, through being present for those who followed him, and through leading with integrity. One evening, as he sat in his office going over the day's reports, there was a knock at the door. The officer looked up, surprised, as a familiar face entered the room. It was the guard who had refused to salute all those months ago. He had never asked for special recognition, nor had he sought praise for what he had done. In fact, he was just like any other soldier, quietly doing his job. But now, after everything that had changed, the officer couldn't help but wonder if there was more to this soldier than just his defiant stance. "Sir," the guard said, standing at attention, though his demeanor was more relaxed than it had been before. "I wanted to speak with you." The officer nodded, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Please sit down. What's on your mind?" The guard hesitated for a moment, then took the seat. His expression was serious, but there was something different in the way he looked at the officer now. It was as though there was a deeper understanding between them, a shared respect that didn't need words to define it. "I wanted to thank you, sir," the guard began, his voice steady but sincere, "for everything that's changed. For the way you've led us since that day." The officer raised an eyebrow. "You don't need to thank me. I've done nothing more than try to do my job as a leader. You've all made the difference, not just me." The guard shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "That's the thing, sir. You've changed the way we all think. Before, we followed orders because that's what we were supposed to do. But now it feels like we're part of something, like we're all working toward the same goal. It's not just about orders anymore, it's about trust, and that's something you've earned." The officer felt a warmth in his chest at the guard's words. He had always known that leadership was about more than just authority, but to hear it expressed so clearly, so simply, was something he hadn't expected. It was a reminder of how far they had all come. "I'm glad to hear that," the officer said, his voice quieter now. "That's exactly what I've been striving for. To make this about more than just commands and compliance. To make it about respect on both sides." The guard nodded. "You've done that, sir, and you've made us better for it. We all feel it. We work better together now, and we're more motivated than we've ever been before." There was a brief pause as both men considered what had been said. The officer leaned back in his chair, reflecting on everything that had happened. It had been a long journey, one that had tested his values and his understanding of what it meant to be a leader. He had learned, sometimes the hard way, that respect couldn't be forced. It had to be cultivated through actions, through honesty, and through showing those who followed you that you cared about them, not just about the mission. "You know," the officer said, his tone thoughtful, "I used to think that leadership was about being strong and unwavering, about keeping control. But now I see that it's about something else. It's about giving the people you lead the space to think for themselves, to grow and to contribute. It's about making them feel like they matter, like their input matters. When you do that, they'll follow you, not out of obligation, but out of respect." The guard's eyes flickered with something that looked like agreement, though he remained quiet for a moment. Finally, he spoke. "I think that's why we all respect you now, sir. You're not just a leader who gives orders. You're a leader who listens. You've made us feel heard." The officer smiled softly. "It's not easy, is it?" The guard shook his head. "No, sir, but it's worth it." There was another moment of quiet between them, but this time it wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was a peaceful silence, the kind that comes from mutual understanding. The officer's thoughts shifted to the rest of the guard. He had spent so many years trying to maintain control, thinking that strength and authority were the most important aspects of his position. But he now saw that true strength came from creating a team, from building relationships that were based on trust and mutual respect. It wasn't about his authority or his title. It was about the people who followed him and how they saw him. He wanted to be a leader they could rely on, a leader they could look to for guidance, not just a figurehead who gave orders. "I'm proud of what we've built here," the officer said quietly, looking the guard in the eye. "And I couldn't have done it without all of you. We've all changed together. We've all learned something about leadership, about trust, and about what it means to be part of a team." The guard gave a small, appreciative nod. "We've all learned something, and we're better because of it." The officer leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "There's still a long way to go, but I believe in this team. I believe in all of you, and together we can accomplish anything." The guard stood up, nodding. "We'll make sure of it, sir. We're all with you." As the guard left the office, the officer sat back in his chair, reflecting on the conversation. It wasn't just about the progress they had made. It was about the path they were on now. It was a path built on respect, trust, and a shared commitment to something greater than any individual. He felt a sense of fulfillment, a deep knowing that he was leading in the right way. Looking out the window of his office, he could see the palace grounds stretching out in front of him, peaceful and quiet under the setting sun. The future was uncertain, but for the first time the officer felt prepared for whatever it held. He had the support of his men, their trust and their respect. And with that, he knew they could face anything together. He smiled to himself, content in the knowledge that the true measure of leadership wasn't in how loud or forceful a person could be. It was in how they made others feel. It was in the relationships they built, the trust they nurtured, and the respect they earned. The officer had learned that lesson, and he was determined to carry it with him for the rest of his career.